All right. Good evening, everyone. It looks like we got several people tuning in here already, and good to have everybody here. Continuing along our study. I guess I could move on over to my slide images so I can talk about the stuff I have on the slides. We're here every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Working our way through this book. Right now, after tonight, we'll be just under halfway through this study, but definitely not too late to get a book if it's something you would like to have either to read for class or later as a future reference. Tried to put together kind of a nice little summary of the biblical story that would be accessible to everyone. I know we've got some people here tuning in both from Facebook and from YouTube, so good to have all of you with us. Let's see. Yeah, if you need a copy of this, I do have some extra copies. We ordered for everyone who pre-ordered them, and then so many extra people were requesting them, we bought several additional ones. So I've got a small stack of them in my office, so probably not going to run out. If you decide you didn't get one and want to get one, or you'd like to get an extra one to give to somebody, we've got those. Glad to distribute those. Okay, so we are next week going to be looking at chapter 7, putting the pieces back together. And as we'll see, it's kind of like Humpty Dumpty, right? Like once you've been divided, conquered, and scattered, there is a future involved, but it's not a reverting to the world like it was. Kind of the way we've been talking about this coronavirus situation, where you can't even, I've been trying intentionally not to use the words get back to normal because I don't think whatever it is we're getting back to will ever quite be the way that it was before, right? Like we're moving on into some new stuff. Let's see. Oh, Joy, this is called The Story of God's People. You can buy it from a 21st Century Christian. I think it's 21stcc.com. The publisher sells it directly. I believe this is also for sale on Amazon. And I don't know where you're located, Joy, but if you were in Corpus Christi, I'd be happy to have you stop by the building and I can get you a copy there. But The Story of God's People. It's a 13-lesson overview of the biblical story. Next week we'll be talking about what happens after they are divided and conquered. But just the same, that is our topic for this week. The sad situation of the kingdom, the promised land, which to them seemed kind of like the end-all be-all thing that they wanted. They got their own land. They really became a nation. And they did hang on for a while, but after just a few hundred years, they had really become as bad as the people that had occupied the land before them. It's an unfortunate thing. Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, good to have. We do actually have a lot of, it's so weird, like the McCains and the Degollados are here, and I know you guys all have relocated, but you continue to join us, and we're so happy that you do. And it is easy, since I see you so regularly on here, it's easy for me to forget I won't see you Sunday morning, but we're glad you guys are staying in touch and continuing to be here with us. And Joy, we'll be glad to have you guys with us and look forward to meeting you. And please do come up and say hi to me or something the first time you're around so I can meet you and greet you personally. All right, lesson for tonight, divided and conquered. And that is the way that the story goes. They have a kingdom, they've gotten territory, and at first they're kind of ruled... I don't know. There's not a lot of structure to it. And so you have judges sporadically popping up to kind of deal with problem situations, try to call people back to covenant. You have the prophet Samuel, who's a prominent leader. But after Samuel's the one who anoints Saul as the first king. And from there, they're dealing with kings. And it's not long until you've got kings in the north and in the south and all the trouble that goes with having two separate territories. So here's a question, and I would invite you to type your answer, post it in a comment, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. I'll see all of them either way. What is something that you have learned in hindsight? And I know, like I asked a similar question a few weeks ago in one of my sermons where I said, if you could go back to yourself at half your current age, what would you say to yourself? The most common responses I got were people saying things like, buy Google stock. that kind of stuff. But I bet there are some things we've learned in hindsight. So, especially looking back over your life, some of your experiences, maybe some of your losses along the way, what are some things that you've learned looking backwards that you just didn't grasp at the time? Hindsight can be a pretty good teacher. And Joe, this is a painful truth, but I think it is truth that there's a lot you can do for people. There's the old idiom about you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It really is true that you cannot do more for people than they're willing to do for themselves. You can, but it doesn't work, right? You can't force someone to change against their will. You can get kind of minimal compliance, but the moment they don't have to, they'll go right back to doing whatever they want to do. People have to want to change in order to change. And often people won't change until the pain of changing is less than the pain of staying the same. We can sit with numbness or mild pain for a pretty long time and say, well, I don't like it, but at least I know what I'm dealing with. The fear of the unknown keeps a lot of people from living a better life than they could. But yeah, Joe, that's a hard truth, but I think you're right. You can't fix people. You have to ultimately let that be God's work, right? God is the one at work in us through the power of the Spirit, helping to bear fruit within us, helping us to be conformed to the image of Christ. We're partners with God in that, but ultimately that is the work of God. It is not my job, my ability even to fix people. This is good. Wisdom comes from experience. Experience comes from lack of wisdom. Interesting little tie-in there. Yeah, wisdom comes from experience. Experience comes from lack of wisdom. There's something you need to know, so you have to try it in order to know. Change, scary and difficult. At least if we think it's going to be scary, we imagine it to be difficult. Some changes are, but then some changes aren't so bad, right? There are certain things that if you're not a person who's super prone to just be spontaneous and you like to know what's going on and you like to be prepared, sometimes change seems scarier than it actually is once it gets here. But yeah, it kind of depends on the change, doesn't it, Kathy? Yeah, so Joe, I have a friend who used to tell me his philosophy was the advantage of being a pessimist is that you're either always right or pleasantly surprised. So always have low expectations, so you're never disappointed. I don't know, Joe. I think there's some back and forth on that one. Not healthy to set unrealistic expectations for people. And, that's something I've had to be really careful with over the years where, sometimes you get a person who one day is wanting to praise you and say you're the greatest person they've ever had, the greatest minister they've ever worked with. That's almost inevitably followed by the first time it becomes clear that I'm human and maybe I can't be all things to all people, then you kind of go from the pedestal to being the doormat. That's kind of how that seems to work a lot of times. So you don't want to set unrealistic expectations for people, but a lot of times I think our happiness can be elevated by not expecting more from people than what is reasonable. I guess part of that wisdom and experience that Randall was talking about, with experience over time, we get a little wiser about what we can and should expect from people. Empathy helps us a lot in that. Yeah, good stuff. So lots of things we can learn in hindsight. A lot of what we're looking at now, I think as these stories are written down for us, Israel would probably say they had a lot to learn looking back. Don't put people on a pedestal because they can't stay there. And and especially if you're the one being put on the pedestal, a lot of times, I didn't ask for that. Wasn't trying for that. All right, so good comments. Invite you to keep them coming if you got some more thoughts. This is interesting to me. The Book of Ecclesiastes. It's just such a good book. One of these days, I'm going to either preach through it or teach a class on it or something. But it's like I know I'm going to love it when I do it, and so I've been kind of putting it off for that reason. Like I want to wait till the right season. I know I did a sermon study on Proverbs, then Kevin did that class on Proverbs, and so I'm kind of waiting a while on Ecclesiastes, I think. But despite the negative way in which so much of Ecclesiastes is framed, If you look at chapter 2 in verses 17 to 19, he's reflecting on the nature of inheritance and the way that you might spend your entire life building a business empire. And whether it's your biological family members who take it on or just someone who, takes over ownership, how many businesses do you really see that last more than 2 or 3 generations? And a lot of times it's by the 3rd generation that, pretty much the family's going to have to hand it off because they don't have a, competent family member left to do it, or at least no one who wants to do it. But he warns in this passage, he says, I've seen people absolutely give their life and health and everything they've got to build and accumulate something of value, at least earthly value, only to hand it off to someone who, forgive me, is kind of a moron. And that's sometimes what happens. There's no guarantee, no matter how much you love the people, whether it's your family members or whoever else you're handing your stuff off to. We love people. There's no guarantee they won't be idiots. And so your heirs may not be wise. So be very careful about what you save up and what you treasure in this world. Jesus talks about that, doesn't he? Being really cautious about what we treasure, because wherever your treasure is where your heart will be as well. So make sure you're storing up things that will last, Jesus says, not things that can be destroyed by rust and moths, and I would say salt in the air down here in South Texas. But yeah, be careful about what you're passing on. I thought it might be helpful to give kind of an overview of some of the things we've talked about up to this point. Okay, we got a couple more comments here. Maggie says, you can't change people's behavior, but you can change how you react to them. That is correct, Maggie. The only thing I'm in full control of is my own behavior. Even as it pertains to my emotions, you can't necessarily help what you feel, but you have to make a decision about what you will do with the things that you feel. It is okay to feel emotions and have emotions, even very strong emotions, sometimes even emotions that run counter to my intellect. That's always a struggle for me. Is I'll be in a situation where, maybe what I feel is deep disappointment over something that happened, even though intellectually I'll get the reasons for why it happened. Sometimes our emotions and our intellect are not on the same page, so that's okay. But it's important that I don't just become my emotions because I have them. So just because I feel angry doesn't mean I have to act angry. And just because I feel happy or even maybe gloating or something, you don't have to enact that. Sometimes you can keep that to yourself. But you're right. We have control over how we act and react. And I tell you, if I have the option, my preference is to act rather than react. I would prefer to always try and choose the path I'm intending to walk and let other people adjust to that. Let them react to me rather than me react to them. But yeah, good thought. That's a good quote. Thank you, Cheryl. Experience is a expensive teacher, but fools will learn at no other. I think it's Dave Ramsey who talks sometimes about paying your stupid tax. You make a stupid decision and it's going to cost you. And that's the stupid tax, as he calls it. All right, so walking through the story up till now, because I am trying to provide kind of an overview. I'm hoping you're able to see the flow as we go from lesson to lesson. We start with creation. We talked about the nature of God and who God is before the world is created. But the world is created. One of the things about how this world was created is that because God built agency and free will into humanity, intrinsic in the way the world was designed, even though I don't want to say God created evil, God created a world where evil choices were possible. That people could choose to love him or reject him, to act out of love or act out of fear or selfishness or whatever else. And so sin enters the world not very long after human beings enter the world. And we have to think about sin as an active, corrupting presence like a cancer. And sin and its effects are present from that point on. We're not dealing with a world that is a vacuum or morally neutral. We're dealing with a world that is already in conflict between the powers of good and light, the powers of evil and darkness. And that is that battle is a constant. It's not always a constant who's winning in which places, right? Sometimes it feels like progress. Sometimes it feels like regress. But sin is present from that point. There is the flood, where functionally God says, I'm just going to unplug this thing and reboot it. And so the thing everyone always thinks they wish God would do, just come down and deal with sin and wipe the world clean of all the corrupt people and just leave the good people. I mean, he did it, and then we just all got corrupt again. So you have the corruption of sin, you have God's judgment in the flood. Not long after the flood, there's the situation at Babel, but ultimately all this is pointing us toward Abraham's family. If you haven't been attending with us, I just started a new sermon series on Abraham. The first lesson in that series is now available on our YouTube and Facebook pages from this most recent Sunday. And if you haven't tuned in already, I'm excited about this content. It's been very well received so far. So we're going to do kind of a deep dive on Abraham on Sunday mornings, and not just in person, but also in our streaming content. But Abraham becomes very significant in the history of Israel because it all starts with him. And so there's a promise made to the man Abraham. God does honor the promise. A man becomes a couple. Abraham and Sarah become a larger family, and they go from that to becoming really a people of Israel. And they have tribes based on the various family members and households. And eventually, because of famine, they have to go down into Egypt. They're there for, I believe it's like 450 years total, much of that as slaves of the Egyptians. This is where God swoops in and remembers his promise to Abraham, that he had promised that he would deliver them when this happened. And so God sends Moses back to Egypt. He had been fleeing from there, and Moses is the one who leads the people out of Egypt up to the border of the promised land. And then Joshua and Caleb, who had been some faithful spies under Moses' leadership, they're the ones who are going to go on and help lead the people to occupy the land. Once they've got the space, at some point they have to get a little better organized. And so even though God doesn't love the idea of kingship, and we looked last week at a lot of things God expresses about the problems with it, just the same, it's what the people thought they wanted. And so they appoint kings, and that's kind of where we are at this point in the story. So I hope that overview wasn't too fast, but that's the flow so far. So looking at the phases of the kingdom, here's a little bit of a zoom in to where we are. You start with the kingdom united, and in fact, it's not only united, it's expanding under David and under Solomon. And the biggest the kingdom ever gets, the widest the borders reached were under the reign of Solomon. He was vastly affluent, highly respected because of his wisdom, and just all the kinds of things he'd been able to do. Very, very impressive person by any standard. But his son, we talked about Ecclesiastes. Your children may not be as wise as you are. Solomon had a son named Rehoboam who just blew the thing in half. He really wasn't a wise guy. Rather than listening to the advice of his father's advisors, who probably were pretty wise themselves, he just kind of pushed them to the side and talked to his buddies who didn't know any more than he did, treated people really harshly, and half of them said, hey, let's bail on this guy. So the kingdom divides and still functions for a while, but eventually things got so corrupt, especially starting in the north, where the northern kingdom is taken over by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. You may remember, if you were here for our study of the Minor Prophets, we spent a lot of time talking about this part of Israel's history, where you've got the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, the north falls, then the south falls, because all of the minor prophets are positioned somewhere in that sandwich of events. But 722 BC, very important date. This is when the northern kingdom falls. The southern kingdom is where Jerusalem is located. The southern kingdom hangs on for a while. They managed to go for a while longer, but not that much longer. It's also notable, I think, that in the northern kingdom, once it was divided, they pretty much never had a good king by God's standard. That is not to say they never had any kings that were economically successful. That's the way we tend to judge people, right? Is how good did the economy do? Okay, that made someone a good ruler or a bad ruler. How was the economy? That's not how God evaluates leaders. God's looking at righteousness in the land. And in the north, unfortunately, there was just a lot of corruption. We'll talk some more about that. The southern kingdom did have, it seems, a total of about two really good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. And despite some good things that they did and some temporary periods of turning back to God, they were two in a long line of rotten eggs, unfortunately. And so Jerusalem falls 586 BC, and once, we would refer to the north as Israel, the south as Judah, and especially once Jerusalem's out of the picture and the temple's been, burned to the ground, that's kind of the end of everything for them. All right, so I'm just kind of curious, because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history of people in Israel and Judah. Who has left an indelible imprint on your life? That word indelible meaning one that will not fade away. Some people do this in good ways. Some people do this in bad ways. But I'm just kind of curious, probably happier to dwell right on the good ones. But maybe you've got something profound you ought to share about something that maybe made a negative impression on you and changed you somehow. But that's my next question. I'd love to have your comments on who has left an indelible imprint on your life. I've been fortunate to have many people that I've been able to look to and say, I'll never be them, but by becoming a little more like them, it's helped my life to be easier. It's helped my decisions to be wiser. It's helped me do things that I can feel good about. So, I've got lots of people I can think of from within my family, the churches that I've attended. There's a lot of positive role models. I don't know about you guys, but truthfully, there have been a few along the way too that I've looked at and said, well, I don't know exactly what makes a person become like that, but one of my life goals is never become that person. I don't want to do what they did. I don't want to come across the way they come across. There's the things you say about, well, I know, like when you're a kid, you say, well, my parents are doing this to me. I'll never do that to my kids. Sometimes you end up doing that. But it's not just your parents you might look at and say, hey, what that person's doing, I'm never going to go there. And sometimes maybe you eat those words later, but a lot of times it might shape you. So I'm just kind of curious. Yeah, I know, Joe, you've said to me on several occasions about how much you were fond of your parents, and I know that you just really admired them and they were great people and wonderful influences on you. And that's a terrific thing to be able to say. Not everybody, unfortunately, can think of their parents with such fondness. Of course, some grow up and for various reasons might not even have one or both parents in the picture at all. But when you have two parents, especially if they're good ones, boy, you can't overstate the value of having that in your life. Yeah, parents are really important. I bet some of you have also had some teachers or professors along the way who helped you think a lot about what you do and how you do it. I did an interview with Kevin Burr, our discipleship minister, a few weeks ago for his podcast, and that was one of the questions he was asking me, and I was able to mention a couple of professors who maybe introduced me to some things I had never known about before that have become really impactful for me. Very, very beneficial. Charlie Dodd, Frank, I am so happy that I got to interact with Charlie Dodd some before he passed away. He was around for, I know at least the first year, I think maybe a couple of years that I was here, but early on I also got to have a few experiences. We went to a funeral, me and actually Larry Reynolds and Charlie, and several of us rode together. And when we were in the car, I had a nice conversation with Charlie, and there's something else I interviewed him about along the way when I was doing my graduate school studies. But yeah, just a really positive guy. I know people talk about him as kind of a powerful individual, especially when he was kind of in the height of his career and eldership, that really influential person. But I know that a lot of people would speak very highly of Charlie. And see, a lot of y'all are testifying here about what he was like. Amazing man, great influence on so many. I've got my own positive Charlie Dodd stories as well. Yeah, he's a good guy. Let's see. I can think of two elders' wives when I was growing up that I have known who became my mentors. I want to follow their examples. That's right, Cheryl. Nice to have someone giving you some model of, if I'm going to occupy this role in life of like a Christian woman or a Christian man, when that's done well, what does that look like? We really need role models, don't we? Joyce Reynolds. Yeah, both Reynoldses were workhorses and good people, salt of the earth, and involved with so many good things. Um, yeah, so yeah, a lot of y'all are making nice comments here and kind of reminiscing. So yeah, so I think we've all got people who have left an impact on us. And again, how happy it is that when I ask that question, the first place your mind goes is to the good things that we're focused on, because it's not always the case that the mark people leave is a positive one. I don't think you can talk about the history of kingship in Israel and not give a fair amount of space to talk about Jeroboam, son of Nabot. Oh, good. I've got a few more comments rolling in here. Yes, Adrian, your parents, and Matt. Yeah, all good people. Good people. Thank you for sharing that. Parents and aunts and uncles. Whitney, when I try to explain the Trinity to people and what it is to be invited into the love of God, I usually invoke language about family, and especially like a big family get together where as a young child you don't really fully grasp where you are or who you're with or how all these people are somehow connected to you. But even as one who is new to the picture, you feel accepted and wanted and valued, and that's a great thing. So I think, what is it like to be part of the the family of God, the kingdom of God? It's something like having a really good, welcoming family, and so yeah, that's good. That's good. Hello, Connie, and good to have you guys tuning in. Send my greetings to John, and I hope you guys are doing well. So I wanted to mention this guy, Jeroboam, the son of Nabot. And he's not a guy we typically fixate on, but the reason I've come to kind of look at him a lot is that if you've ever tried studying through the Kings, this is like a rookie preacher mistake, but when I first started teaching class in Rosebud, Arkansas, I decided, I didn't know what else to study, so I thought, well, I like Elijah and Elisha and that stuff. So I did a study of 1st and 2nd Kings, vast majority of which is negative stories about people who did a bad job ruling. And it was a broken record where again and again and again it would say, well, there was this king. And again, sometimes financially very prosperous. Like sometimes you'd have a king who had a booming economy, but they would say, but he didn't take down the high places where they were worshiping, on the false altars to the non-existent fake gods. They didn't take down the high places. They didn't do away with the corruption, and they followed in the way of Jeroboam, son of Naboth. They invited the people to the same kinds of sins that he did. So even though the economy might have been ticking upwards, God says, no, this guy's a failure. This guy was a failure because he didn't turn them away from the sins. And again, Jeroboam's name will show up again and again and again. So if you haven't read through 1st or 2nd Kings recently, I think for the shadow he casts in the text, we probably should talk about him more often than we do. And so I didn't take the time to parse out what all of these verses are about, but that name, Jeroboam, son of Nabot, that name combination shows up 25 times, at least in the version I was searching, and many of those are referencing what an evil guy this was and how he caused Israel to sin and how people kind of followed in his footsteps. So the fascinating thing about Jeroboam is that as he becomes king in Israel, God approaches him much the way that God had approached Solomon. God came to him and is saying, I actually want to help establish your kingdom, but I want you to be just. I want you to be righteous. I want you to turn people's hearts to me. And he just doesn't want any part of it. Jeroboam is a pragmatist. Jeroboam is worried about primarily, the economic interests of the territory that he's ruling over. And so he established these 2 unauthorized temples, one in Dan and the other in Bethel. So I probably should have stuck a map up for this point. But, you've got the northern and the southern kingdom, and each of them has a capital city. In the north, Samaria is the capital city. In the south, Jerusalem is the capital city. And so Dan is kind of like the northernmost part of the country, and Bethel is pretty close to the southernmost part of Israel in the north. So Jerusalem is the city where God's temple is established. Jerusalem is the place they were to worship. And what Jeroboam does is that he looks at the situation and says, I can't have these people going across the border to do their acts of worship every year at the Passover or these other festivals. He said, as long as they keep staying attached to the southern kingdom, my power is threatened. Maybe some of my economic boom is threatened. And so he puts up a temple in Dan in the north and then in Bethel in the south. And he says, why go to Jerusalem to worship when you can worship right here? And so he builds what God views as pagan worship sites. I've actually been to the one in Dan. I think I put a picture of it up one Sunday, but Dan's rock formation for that altar is all still there. And part of how you know it was a pagan altar is that God's instructions, wherever they were to build altars for him, is that it was to be unhewn stone, just rough rocks. And it's like all smoothed out and leveled and designed. And so this is how you know they were worshiping pagan deities there. So Jeroboam invites idol worship into the kingdom quite intentionally, and they never recover. So you want to talk about an indelible, unfading mark. Jeroboam definitely left one. All right. I would also mention, this is interesting to me. When you see the conflict between Jews and Samaritans in the time of Jesus, I think for a lot of us, if you don't know about what happened in the northern kingdom related to Jeroboam, I know as a child, for me, the Samaritans kind of come out of nowhere. It's like, I thought the Philistines were the bad guys, right? But the deal with the Samaritans is, remember, there's the northern kingdom, Samaria is the capital. There's the southern kingdom, Jerusalem is the capital. Samaria was the capital city in the north. There was a large amount of idolatry happening there. And so what starts happening is that the people in the southern kingdom, they viewed the north as a bunch of godless heathens. And beyond that, they were intermarrying with all the other peoples around them. So they would start saying at some point, it's like, for lack of a better term, they're kind of becoming like half-breeds, right? They haven't kept the line pure because they intermarried with all those other people. And so they start to really disparage and look down on the people in the north. And when the northern kingdom falls in 722 BC, a few years before the southern kingdom falls, this helped kind of boost a sense of moral superiority in the south, where they'd say, see, all those godless people, they got what they deserved and they did what they did and God cut them down, right? And so all that pertains to, when you're talking about the problems with Samaritans, what you're really talking about are the problems with idolatry and infidelity in the northern kingdom, of which Samaria was the capital. And so even in Jesus' time, several hundred years later, the way that they just view Samaritans as absolute scum of the earth, don't talk to them, don't know them, don't let them in your house, don't go near them, that's all still stemming from Jeroboam, really, and some of his actions. So there's got to be some sort of a life lesson there, right? There's got to be some sort of life lesson about the actions that I choose to do, or also the actions that I refrain from. You just don't have any idea how long those things might keep reverberating, because your actions might impact what becomes the culture of the people you're close to. And boy, culture is hard to change or get rid of. Culture persists. But Jeroboam contributed to a culture of idolatry and paganism. And at the time that Jesus is talking to that woman at the well, they've got some differing theology. They've got some points they don't agree upon, which mountain is more significant and all that sort of thing. Thought that was worth pointing out, just to understand what a long shadow is cast by someone who moves others towards evil. It's a thing we have to be careful about. Here's another question, and this is more of a yes or no question. I'm just wondering, do we sometimes believe we have holiness by proximity? Where even though I'm not doing anything, I'm not really contributing anything, I'm not helping out in any way, because I know and am friendly with a bunch of people who are doing those things, I kind of pat myself on the back and give myself credit for them. I wonder if we ever do that. I don't know if you've ever had anyone in your life. We were talking about people who've influenced you. Maybe it would be something like, on the judgment day, when I'm standing in line, I would love to stand next to that man, that woman, because maybe God will be so happy with them, he'll just go ahead and let me on in just because I was standing next to him. I've had this issue happen to a degree. Families are all different in how they view people who are ministers. I happen to be from a background where my family and extended family all value what I do and are happy that I do it. But I've got some family members on the outskirts who have really made some poor life choices. And not that you just want to beat anyone up for their life choices, right? I'm not interested in just making them feel perpetual guilt and shame, but it's kind of like, without ever lifting a finger to do anything for God or making any effort to connect with God, it's like, well, I got this, cousin whatever who's a preacher, and so therefore, like somehow they helped to make that happen, right? So easy to say, because the people around me maybe are good or doing good things, I'll just go ahead and count myself as if I'm part of that. And I think we all have to be asking, like, what am I personally doing to help out, contribute, make a positive difference? Yeah, Maggie, considering the geographic location of Nazareth, how do they escape being considered Samaritans? I think it would just have something to do with, they did still stay fairly divided. Some of the territories around that area, certainly separating out like the Jews and the Gentiles. When you look at the archaeological findings, you look to see whether or not there are pig bones, where they were cooking. And if there's no pig bones, they were Jews. If they're pig bones, they were probably Gentiles. But they just managed to kind of keep their distance from each other. And it's the kind of thing where maybe outsiders would tend to group them in together more, but to the Jews and Samaritans, they were not the same thing. It's kind of like, so I'm married to a person who is actually from Mexico, but if you go to someone who is from Costa Rica and say, well, you're basically Mexican, that's like saying to one of us, well, you're from like Canada. You're basically Canadians from the same continent, right? And you would say, of course not. Or you could say, well, you're all like a bunch of Oklahomans. You're like, no, I'm not. I'm Texan. It's like, well, they're next door to each other. Same thing. Like, no, it isn't. It's not the same thing. And so I think they probably would interpersonally keep strong barriers in place, even if it would be hard to, they did have to keep some level of proximity to each other. But you'll see Jesus even say at certain points, like they have to pass through what they know to be Samaritan territory. Let's see. Yes, this is true, Easter Bell. It is on us to form our own relationship with God. So important to do that. Good that you don't practice holiness by proximity. But some people, I do think this is a temptation for. And so the way this, I think, is kind of happening in the southern kingdom is that they would say, well, up in the north, all those godless heathens turned to idolatry. They intermarried. God let them have it, and they fell, and they got what they deserved. Down here, we've got Jerusalem. We got the Ark of the Covenant. We've got the Temple of Solomon. We're the epicenter of, true worship of God. And so it would be easy to say, because I'm close to the temple, because the temple's around, like, no way anything bad is going to happen to me. And so I really think that despite the fact that they demonstrably had pretty bad corruption in the southern kingdom as well, it's like they had this thing in their head that said, as long as the temple's here, that'll probably protect us. God's not going to let his own temple get destroyed. God's not going to let, someone come in and plunder the Ark of the Covenant, any of that stuff, the mercy seat. But in fact, that is what happened, and they were not prepared for it. But somehow they were thinking, because we're the holy city, it makes us better than everyone else. So I think that can take shape in a lot of different ways, but we always have to be very careful about trying to base our sense of holiness, or especially like some sort of elitist status, on something so unimportant as geography, location, or somebody we know, right? Like you can't name drop your way into heaven apart from the name of Jesus Christ, right? If you know him and he knows you, you're good. But there isn't any other name dropping you can do that's going to solve that one for you. I would also mention that once the temple is destroyed and looted, this is an absolute low point in Jewish history. For us, we talk about pandemic, and there's all the social media posts people were making, a year and a half ago about how, well, we can't be together, but the building was never the church anyway. Well, the thing is, that's true for Christians, but for the Jewish people, that temple was highly significant. It was the representative, presence of God. In fact, the literal presence of God, they believed, dwelt there behind the veil. That super thick veil, the Holy of Holies, where God's real presence was. It mattered that you've worshipped in Jerusalem and you traveled to Jerusalem, because that's where you really meet God and connect with God. And even though God is everywhere, it took on a real significance for them. So, though it would be devastating to have a church building be demolished or destroyed, I think even more so for them, where, well, how do you worship God if you can't make sacrifices to Him? How do you connect with God when the holy city is off limits and filled with unholy things? So that location for them, the promised land and the religious center within the promised land, losing all that was, it would be difficult for us to appreciate how devastating that must have been. Psalm 137, I'm not going to read all of it. Spoiler alert, the ending of this psalm, man, it's over the top. It's really over the top. This is where, in the Bible, you have a psalm where, in kind of the form of a song to God, a prayer to God, it is the request that God would, the people who did all these things to us, smash their infants against the rocks. Like, who could wish that on anybody? It says something about the depths of suffering they had gone through, that they could get to that point. I think the valuable thing for me of this psalm is, if I ever do feel really angry about something, or feel vengeful, or like I ought to be avenged somehow for something that happened, if you go to Psalm 137, try to let these words become your prayer to God. Usually I get to the end of the psalm and say, well, God, I'm mad, but I'm not that mad. Like, I don't want that to happen to anybody. But the way this begins is so interesting. Here's kind of a vivid picture of what it was like for them. The north had fallen, and now the south has fallen. And this is the song they write about the episode. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? And that's the question I was talking about. Really, for them, it's not just like a rhetorical thing. Like, how do I do this? How do we worship anymore? Everything we knew about worship has been yanked out from under us. How do we offer legitimate sacrifices? How do we pass on our faith to our children where we don't have the places to go and to learn and be taught? Like, it is a devastating loss for them. And then there's the shame on top of it, right? Like, it'd be bad enough to just lose a building but not lose your sense of self-worth. But at this point, they're carried back off into captivity. And the reason why is that they've become as bad as the people they had originally driven out of the land. This is a terrible scenario. I think several months ago I referenced this as well, but there's a scene, I'm pretty convinced, in Blazing Saddles that draws from this. I don't recommend that. It's not a church appropriate movie, but the old Mel Brooks comedy, he's a Jewish guy, and there's a scene where the slaves are being treated badly by their tormentors, who are calling on them to sing one of their old inward spirituals, right? And I'm just 90% sure he must have been remembering this passage from his faith and finding a creative new way to illustrate it. But there's that request. Sing us another one of those Happy Zion songs. And of course, they're asking him to sing it ironically. It's a form of cruelty. Sing to us about how victorious and happy you are, and then go, serve me, slave. Right? It's a really demoralizing time. So unfortunately, I like it when I can have happier lessons to focus on. Unfortunately, this portion of history in Israel in the north, Judah in the south, this is not a happier part of that story. Doesn't mean that there aren't glimmers of hope. It is out of these circumstances that Jeremiah will write in the Book of Lamentations, at the very core of the book, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. So we have strong words of hope and aspirations to joy once again, trusting that God is still there and hasn't forgotten us. But it's a terrible place to be where they are. So I'm using Kingdom of Israel in kind of the broadest sense. What would be some things as you look at how this story has gone? You know, we've seen all that's happened with Abraham and then his family and all that they were given, and then they lose it. They lose so much to where it's just back down to them and a promise. Just the way that Abraham first went down to Egypt. It's just a guy who's got a promise, and he's just got to hope that the person who made the promise is going to honor their word. So, what do you think the Israelites got wrong? What should we be very cautious about in our lives? What should we be cautious about as a church, within culture? I can't imagine we could look at several hundred years of history of a people trying to be the people of God, failing so miserably at it, and not come away with some sort of insight. So, yeah, I'd like to hear your comments on that. What would you say is a takeaway point that we should hear as a word of caution or a word of admonition? Boy, that's it, Randall. Don't worship that which is not God. That's right. Something is going to sit on the throne of your life, and if it isn't God, we sure have a tendency to want to climb up there ourselves or to put something else up there. And as much as we all want to pretend that we're just these, self-made, independent thinking, whatever things that we are, all of us are worshiping something. And if it's not God, it's going to be my worship of how I want people to see me based on my possessions, my worship of how I want people to talk about me based on what I've accomplished. It's going to be something that we put there, isn't it? Don't take your eyes off of Jesus. That was something I said in my sermon this last Sunday. I was talking about Abraham and all that mess with his wife, and Martin Luther's quote I really liked, where he said, Abraham let the word get out of his sight. The promise was there. The promise was solid, but he let himself get distracted and lose sight of it. So we don't need to take our eyes off of Jesus. Part of why, even though I would say it's probably the case, there are some Sundays I don't reflect with as much zeal or whatever that emotion should be when I take communion, because we do it every week. I still think the practice of at least bringing Jesus up every week as a Christian, it's not so much I'm trying to condemn or say who's right or who's wrong for how often people observe communion, but how can I be a Christian and not want to put the death and resurrection of Christ in front of me and within me at least weekly, right? Like how would I want to leave that out of my, weekly part of how I, start my week, remember who I am, remember what God has invited me to do. Keeping our eyes on Jesus, really important thing. Placing more importance on anything other than God, she says. That's right. So it's a question of priorities. Augustine of Hippo famously has talked about the problem of disordered loves, where there's a lot of things that we do love, and it's okay to love a lot of these things, but the problem is when we get our loves out of order, and instead of putting our love for God first, our love for God is subservient to our love for, possessions or whatever else it might be. So that's an important thing. Yeah, placing more importance on anything other than God. That's good. Thank you, Maggie. We look at the Israelites and wonder how they could keep turning away from God, yet it's so easy for us to get caught up in things that distract us from putting God first in our lives. That's right, Kathy. And I try to remind myself sometimes, Satan probably isn't going to win by making all of us aspire to be like Hitler, right? Like Satan's end goal doesn't have to involve a full depraved corruption of every decent person. All he really needs is for us to get lukewarm. Jesus speaks in the harshest terms in Revelation about what it is to be lukewarm, where I've just decided I'm not going to care enough to really be bad. I'm not going to care enough about this to actually actively rebel, but I'm just going to try and ride the fence and never really do anything good or bad. And Jesus doesn't have much use for that. Yeah, easy for us to get caught up in things that just make us lose focus, make us not treat the most important things as the most important things. Terry, God isn't interested in tolerating sin. He doesn't change with the times, nor does he tolerate our judgmentalism in his place. Yeah, man, there's a lot to chew on there in your comment. I appreciate that, Terry. Yeah, God's holiness. I don't, at this point in my life, it's not so, I do think God can be angered, but when I think about the fire of God, I tend to think of it more as the holiness of God, that God's purity is so absolutely brilliant and piercing that anything that is impure would simply get kind of consumed by the presence of him. So it's not that he, is just kind of bothered by sin. It's that sin in his presence simply can't last and it can't withstand. And God doesn't change. He's the same, unlike everything else that constantly changes. That's kind of helpful, isn't it? That we can see what God is like and view that as a constant, especially in the person of Jesus Christ. But this last line is interesting. Nor does he tolerate our judgmentalism in his place. I don't know where this originated, but someone has said, God has told us to be fishers of men, but some of us have instead appointed ourselves as keepers of the aquarium. That I'm going to just, busy myself, kind of nitpicking all the fish when my job was to go out and catch fish. So yeah, when I want to put myself in God's place, judging is something that's got to be handled with great caution and great humility. It is the case, I believe, that we could help a person to look at something in their life and say, these choices that you're making, what is it producing within you? Is it moving you toward God, toward greater peace and greater wholeness and a deeper love for God and for people? Or is this pushing you further in a self-centered or a negative spiral? And, we can confront sinfulness without simply trying to hop up on the judgment seat and slam the gavel, right? Yeah, as often as you do this, that's right, Brenda. Yeah, we want to remember Christ often, and as we do it, be thoughtful about it. Apathy is Satan's greatest weapon. Yeah, this is something. I think a lot of times, if I were to ask you to say, speaking of opposites, what's the opposite of love? I think many people's first reaction would be to say hate. And I don't actually think that's correct. I don't think that hate is the opposite of love. I think hate is a very closely related cousin of love. The things in my life that I've hated, often it's because of how much I have cared about something connected to them. Hate is kind of a second order emotion, just like anger is a second order emotion. You don't experience anger in isolation. You're angry because of something. I think deep hate becomes more possible because some sort of a deep love or devotion or admiration had been present before. So I would say I think that the opposite of love is apathy. The opposite of caring is just not caring. The opposite of treating someone as if they matter is just totally treating them as if they don't matter. I don't know that that's the final answer on that, but I think that's an important thing to think about, that apathy, it's not that hate is the opposite of love, it's that apathy is the opposite of love, in my opinion. Yeah, develop a conscious awareness on stuff that distracts me from my focus on Jesus. If you guys are not in the habit of pulling back at least annually, just to have a look at what you've been doing in your schedule and your life, and asking the question, who am I trying to become? And all these things I'm doing with my time and my resources, are they producing that in my life? And if not, wouldn't I be crazy to just keep on doing everything exactly the way I am? Isn't it worth course correction and trying to figure out where I need to go from here? Very important. Yeah, indifference, apathy. Yeah, the opposite of love. Yeah, if love is passion and concern, indifference would be the opposite of that, wouldn't it? All right, I think I am just about. Oh, here we go. Here's one final question. We're just about out of time. Kind of like this. Trying to put a more positive spin on this negative situation. Despite the terrible things that happen, sometimes good people get caught up in the consequences of powerful bad people's decision making or a bad culture's decision making. If you could write a letter right now to the faithful Israelites who were in exile, feeling hopeless and confused, what would you tell them? What would you say to them? Even if it was just a quick note. If you could write a quick note or a letter to an Israelite in Babylonian captivity, trying to be faithful to God, wondering what in the world is going on, what might you say to them? I'm interested if you have any comments on that. And I think that's something worth asking, worth thinking about. How do you offer comfort to someone who is lost so much and in so much confusion? And I would say, if anything, life advice might not even be the thing they'd need in the moment, right? I think the thing they'd need most would be to feel loved and valued. But there's some things we know in hindsight now that could offer them a word of encouragement. That's right. Yeah, despite how bad it got, there was always hope. It's a great story you're referencing, Randall. Elijah lost sight of this until God told him there were still 7,000 faithful people. Yeah, Elijah has this big showdown with him and the prophets of Baal. And really, it's between God and the prophets of Baal. And, 1 verses 450, just a total blowout, humiliating embarrassment. God is the only God. The prophets of Baal are all put to death. And then, rather than the people repenting of Baal worship, they get mad and want to kill Elijah for proving them wrong. So they're attacking the messenger. And so he's off by himself saying, I'm the only good person and no one cares like I do. And sometimes we need to be, that's part of the value of church, isn't it? Just to be reminded, oh yeah, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one who feels how I feel. And I'm not the only one who's struggling with this. And not the only one who's maybe been discouraged. So we should always hold out hope in God that his will be done. That's right. Remember God's goodness to you in the past. Yeah, it's a pattern, isn't it, Brenda? That we can count on what God will do in the future based on how God has acted in the past. He'll be consistent. Don't give up hope. God is ever faithful to those who love him, and even faithful to those who don't uphold everything as well as they should, right? God continues to honor what he's promised to the world, even when we don't do a great job of holding up our end of the deal. The promise still stands. There's always a new opportunity to turn things around. God's love is unending, and he will never give up on you. And God has more optimism in people than I do sometimes. I know that's the case. Yeah. Very good, very good, very good. Yeah, thank you all for... these are a lot of good responses. What would you say to those Israelites in captivity? So yeah, thank you all for sharing all that. I am out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of move us on. Just want to mention, if you don't already have the Church Center app, several good features there. You can use it to connect to Bible classes, life groups. When we have certain events, you'll be able to check in your kids for the kids classes for worship. We'll have our church calendar present there if you want to see what all is happening at the church, anything you might want to keep an eye on. And we also have links to the apps if you're wanting to donate to us using one of the online formats. So I appreciate you all being here. We'll be back again next Wednesday, 7 p.m. And hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Look forward to chapter 7 next week, where that's going to be our Humpty Dumpty lesson. What do we do with all this now that it's all been smashed and broken apart? With God, there is some hope, right? Thank you all for the kind comments and encouragement, and have a great rest of your night.